Turning now to a new report that shows the massive scope of Russia's disinformation campaign during the 2016 presidential election. According to the Washington Post, the independent report, which was prepared for the Senate Intel Committee, shows Russians used every major social media platform to help elect President Trump.
The report also says Russia worked to discourage opponents of the candidate, Trump at the time, discouraged them from voting, especially minority groups like African Americans. The Senate Intelligence Committee has not said whether it endorses the findings.
Facebook, Google, and Twitter all disclosed last year they had found Russian interference on their site. So let's bring in Dan Patterson. He's a CNET senior producer, and he joins us here at the table. So, Dan, based on this new report, what specific tools did they use to target Americans, and what of the tools that they use makes this all alarming?
So we learned a few things from this new report. It looks as though they use tools that are widely available across the social web and far more social networks than we initially had seen. So we see stuff like Hotmail, Tumblr, Instagram, as well as Pinterest. These resulted in tens of millions of posts that impacted even more millions of viewers on those sites.
And so this disinformation, it wasn't just used to support Donald Trump. It was also used to discourage certain groups from voting at all.
Yeah, in fact, that is one of the most effective influence campaign tactics that we see, not just used by Russia, but by countries like China and Iran. That is to tamp down on dissident or minority groups that may support the opposition. In this case, it was African Americans, Latinos, gay men, were all targeted in kind of cross sections. So if you can imagine how spreadsheets kind of cut and dissect different demographics of people, it was used by the IRA to make cross-sections of people and target various types of propaganda at them.
Wow.
So one of the things I'm interested and intrigued by is there was a conventional wisdom out there that part of the disinformation campaign was just to cause chaos, to give people a sense that the democratic institutions which they believe in are not as strong or as credible as they might have thought. But this does sound as if there was a concerted effort to elect President Trump. Because in the past, you've heard, well, it didn't matter who was going to win. They just wanted to sow dissent and foment dissent. But this clearly points to the fact that whoever was doing this, whoever was behind these campaigns, had an affinity for the candidate Trump, now President Trump.
Yeah, one of the most interesting things that this report does is kind of back up some of the data that we pulled from social media. And we see two things. One, Vlad, it is used, influence campaigns are used to sow chaos and kind of rock our faith and confidence in democratic institutions. But the other thing was specifically to elect President Trump. And when we pulled the data in 2016, and by that I mean just the raw Twitter followers and Facebook comments about Donald Trump, we saw a spike not just after major events, but before events of number of followers and activity, meaning some bots and some real accounts were actively being pushed by what we now know as the IRA right before major events, the New Hampshire primary, the Iowa caucus. So we see this progression, and the data certainly showed it at the time. This report validates what we saw, which are an explicit attempt to elect President Trump.
So the report indicates that pretty much every single social media platform was targeted to be used in this way. You got to wonder whether, Facebook, Google, Twitter, the way they run their businesses, did that have an impact? Did that assist, or did it discourage in any way this use of disinformation as a tool?
Well, it certainly looks as though the mechanics of social media, and by that I mean how posts are shared, how they go viral, how likes, comments, retweets, shares, how the mechanics were used to increase Russian activity across the networks. So this is not surprising, because there is a reason that these companies are so valuable, and that's because they use their own mechanics to sell ads. So the way that the social networks are built inherently was kind of turned against them. This may or may not be their fault. Nobody is pointing a finger at them, at least right now, but they have been kind of opaque in their process and in terms of allowing us to access or understand information leading up to this point. Now, they have all given us statements, but it's been challenging.
Getting information out of them.
Yeah, in fact, we just received in the last hour or so some statements from some of these companies. I think we have some of them that we can throw up there. This is from Facebook. As we've said all along, Congress and the intelligence community are best placed to use the information we and the others provide to determine the political motivations of actors like the Internet Research Agency. We continue to fully cooperate with officials investigating the IRA's activity on Facebook and Instagram around the 2016 election. So there's Facebook's statement, and others are also being released in response to this, because I think a lot of people are starting to feel as if these companies are not being forthcoming. They all make statements like this, and they say we're cooperating, and yet it feels like every week we learn more about what that disinformation campaign was, which of these platforms were used. I mean, some of the numbers here, the 20 most popular pages generated 39 million likes, 31 million shares, 5.5 million reactions, and almost 3.5 million comments. 126 million people on Facebook were reached, and 20 million more on Instagram. That's staggering.
Yeah, and that's less than 24 pages generated that type of reach. And
less than 24 pages, yeah. That's incredible.
If you recall, Mr. Zuckerberg's statements at the time, or just after the 2016 election, indicated that there's no way our platform could be used for influence campaigns and propaganda. So this is maybe not, it's hard to point fingers at them and say, look, you guys should have known that this was occurring, but they, once again, they employ data scientists who examine how the platforms and how the mechanics of the platforms operate. So it's either one or the other, and let me tell you, many reporters, not just here at CBS, but across the media, have tried to dig with Facebook, and it is sometimes like pulling teeth to interoperate with many of these social media platforms and to get real data as opposed to just statements.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you got to wonder, when you talk about numbers like what you just sort of rattled off, I just sort of imagine a spreadsheet. There's got to be just a handful of pages spiking that outrageously. I'm sure it would have stood out.
Yeah.
You would think that.
Yeah.
And look, we can, with our own server logs, say, hey, these IP addresses came from Russia, these IP addresses came from Washington, D.C. So it's pretty easy to understand the destination and the type of content, or at least correlate the origination with content and activity. So it's hard to really know what the truth is here about what they knew and when they knew it. But what we do know is that this has been a year of drip, drip, drip news about the type of activity, the type of activity that exists on these platforms. It's not going to stop. As we ramp up towards 2020, social media is going to be at the vanguard of the news cycle.
All right, Dan Patterson, thank you, my friend, as always.
Good to see you.